Sometimes life gives you a second chance when you least expect it. For 76-year-old Obadiah Lapp, that chance came in the form of a stubborn oyster on the shores of Maine. The old Amish widower had never seen the ocean before. After a lifetime within his quiet community, this first journey beyond felt like stepping into a dream. The massive oyster sat wedged between granite rocks, ancient and weathered. Despite 3 days of patient work with a borrowed knife, it refused to open. Something about its silence reminded him of his own grief-locked heart. Local folks watched the quiet man with curious eyes, whispering about his strange obsession. When the oyster finally cracked open, what fell out wasn't treasure. It was a small wooden horse, carved by hand, identical to one he'd made for his little brother 60 years ago. How could such a thing be possible? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog rolled off Penobscot Bay like a prayer shawl, soft and grey against the weathered shingles of the Anchor Inn. Obadiah Lapp sat on the narrow porch, the wooden horse resting in his calloused palm. 3 months had passed since Sarah's funeral. 3 months of empty rooms and silent suppers that echoed with 52 years of shared conversation. He'd never imagined himself here, 200 miles from the only home he'd ever known. The Ordnung, the unwritten rules that governed Amish life, had never forbidden travel, but neither had it encouraged wandering. At 76, most men his age were content to tend their gardens and wait for grandchildren to visit. But the walls of his farmhouse had grown too close, filled with memories that both comforted and suffocated. The decision to leave had come suddenly, like a thunderclap on a clear day. He'd been sitting at Sarah's quilting frame, running his fingers over her final pattern, a wedding ring design she'd never finished. The silence had pressed against his chest until he could barely breathe. In that moment, he'd remembered something Sarah had whispered during her final days. "Promise me you'll see the ocean, Obadiah. Promise me you'll know there's more to God's world than these 4 walls." Martha Henley, the innkeeper, emerged from the kitchen with a steaming mug of coffee. She was perhaps 60, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that held the wisdom of someone who'd weathered her own storms. "You're up early again?" she observed, settling the mug on the weathered table beside him. "Old habits," Obadiah replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. The Anchor Inn wasn't fancy, just 8 rooms above a small restaurant, but Martha had shown him kindness beyond what money could buy. She'd asked no questions when he'd arrived with nothing but a worn suitcase and had patiently explained the ways of this coastal world. "That little carving's been keeping you company." "I see." Martha nodded toward the wooden horse. "You mentioned you made one like it years ago." Obadiah's thumb traced the smooth contours of the toy. The craftsmanship was identical to his own work, every curve and detail exactly as he remembered carving it for Jacob's 8th birthday. But that horse had disappeared into Willow Creek along with his brother, swept away by spring floods that had claimed too many lives that terrible year. "My younger brother," he said quietly. "Jacob. He was 10 years younger than me, born when I was already helping father in the fields." "A surprise blessing," Mother called him. Martha settled into the adjoining chair, her movements careful and practiced. The inn had been in her family for 3 generations, and she moved through its spaces with the confidence of someone who belonged. "Children often are," she said. "Surprises, I mean. Sometimes the best kind." The ocean stretched endlessly before them, its surface broken by lobster boats heading out for the day's work. Obadiah had spent his first week here simply watching the water, mesmerized by its constant motion. In his world, everything had seasons: planting, growing, harvest, rest. But the ocean seemed to exist outside of time, eternal and unchanging, yet never the same from one moment to the next. "I carved that horse for his birthday," Obadiah continued, the words coming easier now. "Spent weeks on it, working by lamplight after the day's chores. Jacob loved horses, dreamed of having his own someday. Father said maybe when he was older, when he could handle the responsibility. A fishing boat's horn echoed across the bay, low and mournful. Martha waited, understanding that some stories needed their own rhythm. The spring floods came early that year. 1963, the creek behind our property turned into a river overnight. Jacob wanted to see it the way children do, drawn to danger without understanding it. I was supposed to be watching him, but I was 17, more concerned with my own troubles than a boy's curiosity. Obadiah's faded wedding ring caught the morning light, a thin gold band worn smooth by decades of faithful wearing. Sarah had placed it on his finger in a simple ceremony attended by both their families, surrounded by the same fields where he'd spent his entire life. The ring represented more than marriage. It was a symbol of constancy, of promises kept through good years and difficult ones. When we found him, the wooden horse was still clutched in his hand. Both of them swept downstream, both of them lost. He paused, the memory as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. I blame myself for 60 years, Sarah knew, though I never spoke of it directly. She had a way of understanding the wounds I couldn't voice. Martha's hand found his arm, a gentle touch that conveyed understanding without judgment. And now you've found another horse, identical to the one you made. Impossible as it seems, Obadiah lifted the carving, studying it in the strengthening daylight. The wood was aged but not weathered, as if it had been protected from the elements. The knife marks were his own. He recognized every cut, every careful shaving that had brought the horse to life. I don't understand it, Martha. I don't understand any of this. The inn's breakfast guests began stirring inside. Vacationers drawn to Maine's rugged coast, retirees exploring New England's hidden corners. Obadiah had learned to recognize the rhythms of this place, so different from the agricultural cycles that had governed his life. Here, time moved with the tides, measured in the comings and goings of boats rather than seasons. Maybe understanding isn't the point, Martha suggested. Maybe some gifts are meant to be received, not analyzed. Obadiah considered this, rolling the idea around like a smooth stone. His faith had been built on certainty, clear rules, established traditions, predictable patterns of worship and work. The Amish way provided structure, purpose, community. But it also left little room for mystery, for the unexpected whispers of divine grace that couldn't be contained in doctrine. A young family emerged from the inn's dining room, children chattering excitedly about the day's planned adventures. Their father carried a worn guidebook. Their mother herded them toward a minivan loaded with beach supplies. The scene was achingly familiar. The organized chaos of family life, the casual intimacy of shared purpose. He and Sarah had been blessed with 4 children, all grown now with families of their own. But they'd grown distant over the years, not through conflict but through the natural drift that occurred when lives took different shapes. His oldest son Samuel managed the farm now. The others had moved to different communities, following work or marriage to places that might as well have been foreign countries. Do you have children, Martha? Obadiah asked. 1 daughter. Lives in California now, married to a man who designs computer programs. Martha's smile held both pride and wistfulness. 2 grandchildren I see twice a year if I'm lucky. Modern life pulls people in so many directions. The observation hung between them, heavy with shared recognition. Both had learned that love didn't always bridge distance, that families could drift apart even when the bonds remained strong. Obadiah stood, joints protesting the movement. At 76, his body carried the accumulated weight of a lifetime's labor, bent back, gnarled hands, knees that ached before storms. But his mind remained sharp, his faith intact, despite the questions that had driven him to this place. I think I'll walk down to the shore again, he said. The morning light shows things differently. Martha nodded, understanding. I'll save you some breakfast. The blueberry pancakes are particularly good today. The path to the water wound through beach grass and over granite outcroppings that spoke of geological ages beyond human comprehension. Obadiah moved carefully, his plain black shoes finding purchase on the uneven stones. The ocean's voice grew stronger as he approached, not the gentle murmur it had been from the inn's porch. but a full-throated conversation between water and stone that had been going on since the world began. At the water's edge, he paused where the waves spent themselves on the pebbled beach. This was where he'd found the oyster 3 days ago, wedged between 2 massive granite boulders as if placed there deliberately. The spot looked ordinary now in daylight, just another section of Maine's rocky coast. But something had drawn him here that first evening, some instinct he couldn't name. The wooden horse sat warm in his pocket, its familiar weight a constant reminder that his understanding of the world had shifted. In his Amish community, such mysteries would be approached with caution, examined through the lens of scripture and tradition. Unexplained events could be divine providence or dangerous deception, and wisdom lay in careful discernment. But standing here beside the eternal ocean, Obadiah felt something different stirring. Not the cautious faith of his upbringing, but something wilder and more personal, a sense that God's grace might work in ways that transcended human categories. The wooden horse in his pocket seemed to pulse with possibility, a tangible reminder that the impossible might sometimes be simply improbable. A seal's head broke the surface 30 yards out, dark eyes regarding him with curious intelligence before disappearing beneath the waves. The sight brought a rare smile to his weathered face. In Pennsylvania, wildlife was predictable: deer, rabbits, the occasional fox. Here, the very air seemed alive with mystery. He turned back toward the inn, where the smell of Martha's cooking drifted on the salt breeze. For the first time in months, he felt genuinely hungry. The Pemaquid Historical Society occupied a weathered clapboard building that had served variously as a general store, post office, and town meeting hall over its 150-year existence. Thomas Morrison, its current custodian and sole full-time researcher, looked up from a collection of maritime documents as Obadiah entered, the wooden horse wrapped carefully in his handkerchief. "You must be the gentleman Martha mentioned," Thomas said, rising from behind a desk cluttered with charts, photographs, and shipping manifests. He was perhaps 70 himself, tall and lean with wild white hair that suggested a man more concerned with discovery than appearance. "She said you had something unusual to show me." Obadiah unwrapped the carving, placing it gently on the desk between stacks of yellowed papers. Thomas picked up a magnifying glass, studying the horse with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to evaluating historical artifacts. "Remarkable craftsmanship," he murmured. "The wood appears to be sugar maple, aged but well preserved. These tool marks suggest hand carving, probably with a simple pocket knife. The style is consistent with Pennsylvania German folk art, late 19th or early 20th century." He looked up, eyes bright with curiosity. "Martha mentioned you found this inside an oyster 3 days ago down at Miller's Point." Obadiah's voice carried the weight of disbelief even as he spoke the words. "The shell was ancient, sealed tight. Took me hours to pry it open." Thomas set down the magnifying glass, leaning back in his chair. "I've been studying coastal Maine history for 40 years, and I've never heard of organic material being preserved in an oyster shell for any significant period. The environment is simply too hostile: salt water, changing temperatures, constant agitation. Yet here it is." Obadiah touched the horse's mane with one finger. "And the strangest part is, I made one exactly like this 60 years ago. For my younger brother Jacob." The historian's eyebrows rose. "Identical, down to the smallest detail. Every cut, every curve. If I didn't know better, I'd say this was the same horse." Obadiah paused, gathering courage for what came next. "Jacob drowned in 1963 during spring floods. He was holding the horse when they found him. Both were swept away downstream and never recovered." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying both the carving and the weathered face of the man who'd brought it to him. "That's quite a coincidence," he said finally. "I stopped believing in coincidences 3 days ago." Something in Obadiah's tone made Thomas lean forward, his scholar's instincts engaging fully. "Tell me about your brother." "About what happened." The words came harder now, weighted with 6 decades of carefully buried grief. "It was April 15th, 1963. The snow had melted early that year, and then we had 3 days of heavy rain. Willow Creek, which usually ran shallow enough for children to wade across, turned into a torrent overnight. Obadiah's hands found each other in his lap, fingers intertwining in an unconscious gesture of prayer. I was 17, more interested in a girl from the neighboring farm than in watching my little brother. Jacob was curious about everything, always asking questions, always wanting to explore. When the creek started running high, he begged to go see it. The historical society was quiet around them, filled with the accumulated silence of old buildings and older stories. Thomas had learned to recognize the weight of genuine grief, the way it shaped a person's voice and posture even decades after the fact. I took him down there, thinking it would be safe enough if we stayed back from the water. But Jacob saw a piece of driftwood floating past, a branch that looked almost like a boat to his 8-year-old imagination. He wanted to see it better, moved closer to the bank than I realized. Thomas nodded, encouraging the story without pushing. The ground was soft from all the rain. When Jacob stepped too close to the edge, it gave way beneath him. He went into that water so fast I barely saw it happen. I jumped in after him, but the current was stronger than anything I'd ever felt. It carried us both downstream, slamming us against rocks and fallen trees. Obadiah's voice grew quieter, more distant. I managed to grab hold of a tree branch about a quarter-mile down, hauled myself out, scraped and bleeding, but alive. I ran along the bank, calling Jacob's name, searching every eddy and shallow pool. The whole community turned out to help. Neighbors, relatives, even people from other districts. We searched for 3 days. The wooden horse seemed to grow heavier in Obadiah's memory, a weight that had never truly left him. When we found him, he was caught against a log jam nearly 2 miles from where he'd fallen in. Still holding that wooden horse I'd made him, clutching it like it might save him, Thomas reached across the desk, briefly touching Obadiah's arm. "I'm sorry. That's a burden no 17-year-old should have to carry. I was supposed to protect him. That was my responsibility, my failing." The words had worn grooves in Obadiah's soul, repeated countless times over the decades. If I'd been watching more carefully, if I'd kept him further from the water, if I'd been faster getting to him— "You were a boy yourself," Thomas said gently. "And you did try to save him. You risked your own life." Obadiah looked up, surprised by the historian's directness. In his community, such tragedies were accepted as God's will, discussed in terms of divine providence rather than human failing. Comfort came through scripture and prayer, not analysis or absolution. "I've never spoken of it like this," he admitted. "Not even to Sarah, my wife. She knew, of course. The story was told at our wedding, shared among the families. But we never discussed the details, never examined the what-ifs." Thomas stood, moving to a filing cabinet that dominated one corner of the room. "You mentioned the date. April 15th, 1963. That would make today's date significant, wouldn't it?" Obadiah's heart clenched as the realization hit him. "The anniversary. It's the anniversary of Jacob's death, which means you found this carving on April 15th, 60 years to the day after you lost your brother." Thomas pulled out a thick folder, its edges worn from handling. "I don't pretend to understand the mechanics of what you've discovered, Obadiah. But I've learned not to dismiss mysteries simply because they don't fit conventional explanations." The folder contained newspaper clippings, ship manifests, and official reports dating back to the mid-1800s. Thomas spread several documents across the desk, pointing to entries highlighted in yellow ink. Maine's coast has seen thousands of shipwrecks over the centuries. Storms, fog, treacherous rocks, they've all claimed their share of vessels and lives. What's interesting is the pattern of unusual discoveries that wash ashore in the aftermath. Obadiah studied the papers, their formal language describing events that sounded almost mundane in official terminology. Unusual how? Personal items that shouldn't have survived, letters still readable after months in salt water, photographs preserved in impossible conditions, and toys and keepsakes that show no signs of water damage. Thomas tapped one report with his finger. This one, from 1887, describes a music box found inside a sealed container, still playing its tune after being underwater for an estimated 6 months. The implications hung between them like fog, obscuring clear understanding while suggesting shapes that might be real or imagined. Obadiah picked up the wooden horse again, feeling its familiar weight. "You think this horse has been waiting for me for 60 years? I think," Thomas said carefully, "that some stories don't follow the rules we expect them to follow. The question isn't whether it's possible. You're holding the evidence that it happened. The question is what you're going to do with this gift." Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to slant through the windows, casting long shadows across the historical society's accumulated treasures. Somewhere in the building a clock chimed the hour, 3 o'clock. The same time Jacob had fallen into Willow Creek 6 decades ago. Obadiah felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of bonds he'd carried so long he'd forgotten their weight. For the first time since Sarah's death, for the first time since Jacob's drowning, he felt the possibility that his story might not be over, that forgiveness, even self-forgiveness, might still be possible. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," he said. "I came here to grieve my wife, to find some peace beside the ocean she wanted me to see. I never expected. The unexpected is often where grace appears," Thomas interrupted gently. "I learned that when my grandson was killed in Afghanistan. Sometimes the healing comes from directions we never thought to look." The wooden horse seemed to grow warm in Obadiah's palm, as if responding to the possibility of redemption. Outside, the eternal conversation between ocean and shore continued, speaking in a language older than human understanding, but somehow perfectly clear. The Pemaquid Congregational Church sat on a bluff overlooking the harbor, its white steeple pointing toward heaven, while its foundation remained firmly anchored to Maine granite. Obadiah had never worshipped outside the Amish tradition, but something about the building's simple lines and ocean vista drew him like a compass needle, finding true north. Sunday morning found him sitting in the back pew, his plain clothes marking him as different among the congregation of summer visitors and year-round residents. The wooden horse rested in his jacket pocket, its presence both comforting and mysterious, as Reverend Patricia Caldwell took the pulpit. She was perhaps 50, with graying brown hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to look directly into each person's heart. Her sermon touched on the themes of wilderness and wandering, the Israelites in their desert exile, the disciples following uncertain paths toward understanding. "Sometimes," she said, her voice carrying easily through the small sanctuary, "God calls us to leave familiar places not to punish us, but to show us who we really are when stripped of everything we thought defined us." After the service, as congregants lingered over coffee and conversation in the fellowship hall, Reverend Patricia approached Obadiah with genuine warmth. "You're our visitor from Pennsylvania," she said. "Martha Henley mentioned you've been staying at the Anchor Inn for a few weeks now." "Obadiah Lapp," he replied, accepting her offered handshake. "And yes, I've been here longer than I originally planned. Sometimes that happens by the ocean. It has a way of slowing time, making us reconsider our schedules." Her smile was knowing, suggesting she'd seen others caught in Maine's gentle trap. "Would you like to join me for lunch? There's a lovely spot overlooking the water where we could talk." An hour later, they sat at a picnic table outside Cappy's seafood shack, sharing fish and chips while seagulls wheeled overhead in eternal optimism. The wooden horse lay between them on the weathered table, catching afternoon sunlight. "Thomas Morrison called me yesterday," Reverend Patricia said. "He mentioned your discovery and thought I might offer some perspective on matters of faith and mystery." Obadiah had expected judgment or skepticism from an ordained minister. Instead, he found curiosity and openness that reminded him of Sarah's gentle wisdom. "I don't know what to make of it," he admitted. "In my tradition, we're taught to be wary of signs and wonders, to test everything against scripture and community wisdom. This," he gestured toward the carving, "doesn't fit any category I understand. What do you feel when you hold it?" The question was so direct, so personal, that Obadiah almost recoiled. Amish faith emphasized deed over emotion, service over personal revelation. Feelings were private matters, not subjects for theological discussion. Peace, he said finally. For the first time since Jacob died, I feel something other than guilt when I think of him. Patricia nodded, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. And what does guilt accomplish? Does it bring Jacob back? Does it honor his memory? It reminds me of my failure. It keeps me accountable for what I couldn't protect. Or it keeps you trapped in a moment 60 years past, unable to receive the gift your brother's love might still offer. She picked up the wooden horse, examining it with the same careful attention Thomas had shown. This was made with love, wasn't it? Every cut, every smooth curve speaks of patience and affection. I worked on it for weeks. Jacob was so excited about his birthday, counting down the days. He'd never owned anything made specifically for him. Everything in our household was practical, shared, handed down from older siblings. Then this horse represents the best of who you were at 17, the loving older brother who wanted to bring joy to a child. That's the truth carved into this wood, not the momentary distraction that preceded the accident. The insight hit Obadiah like a physical blow. He'd carried the guilt so long, it had become part of his identity, woven into his understanding of himself as fundamentally flawed, perpetually inadequate. But the horse spoke a different truth, of love carefully expressed, of time freely given, of joy intended and delivered. Thomas has been researching similar discoveries, Patricia continued. Items that survive impossible conditions, appearing when people most need them. He calls them grace artifacts, physical reminders that love transcends the boundaries we think contain it. A fishing boat rounded the point, its engine puttering steadily as it headed for the harbor. The normalcy of the sight grounded their conversation in the everyday world, even as they discussed possibilities that stretched beyond conventional understanding. Thomas also mentioned his own loss, Obadiah said. A grandson in Afghanistan. Patricia's expression grew tender. Michael, 22 years old, full of plans and dreams. Thomas blamed himself for not discouraging Michael from enlisting, for not finding ways to keep him safe. The guilt nearly destroyed him. What changed? A letter arrived 3 years after Michael's death, from an Afghan girl whose village Michael had helped protect. She'd learned English just to write to his family, to tell them how Michael had shared candy with the children, how he'd helped rebuild a damaged school. The letter was impossible. It had been lost in the postal system, damaged by water, misrouted through 3 countries. By all rights, it should never have reached Thomas. The parallel was unmistakable. Obadiah felt the wooden horse's weight in a new way, not as a burden of guilt, but as a bridge across impossible distance. Thomas keeps that letter framed in his study, Patricia continued. He says it taught him that love finds ways to continue its work, even when we think the story has ended. That evening, back at the Anchor Inn, Obadiah found himself writing in a notebook Martha had provided. The first time he'd put personal thoughts to paper since childhood school assignments. The words came slowly at first, then with growing fluency as memories long suppressed began to surface. He wrote about Jacob's laughter, high and infectious, filling their farmhouse on winter evenings. He remembered his brother's curiosity about everything, why roosters crowed, how clouds formed, what lay beyond the hills that bordered their valley. Jacob had possessed the kind of wonder that adults spend lifetimes trying to recapture. The carved horse sat on the small table beside his bed, illuminated by the reading lamp's warm glow. As Obadiah wrote, he began to see patterns he'd never recognized before, how Jacob's death had shaped not just his guilt, but his fierce protectiveness toward his own children, his dedication to duty over dreams, his careful construction of a life designed to prevent further loss. Sarah had understood this better than he'd realized. In their 52 years of marriage, she'd never pushed him to travel, never complained about his reluctance to venture beyond familiar boundaries. But she'd planted seeds, casual mentions of places she'd like to see, gentle suggestions about the world's wonders, quiet observations about the beauty that might exist beyond their carefully maintained borders. Her final request, that he see the ocean, hadn't been about the water itself. It had been about learning that safety and love weren't diminished by exploration, that God's grace might be larger than the containers they built to hold it. Outside his window, the harbor lights reflected off the dark water, creating streams of gold that rippled with each wave. Somewhere out there, beneath fathoms of salt water, lay the remnants of countless voyages, ships and cargo, dreams and disasters, all returned to the sea that had birthed them, but also preserved, somehow in ways that defied understanding, were tokens of love that refused to be lost. The wooden horse was proof that some things survived, not because they were strong enough to withstand time and tide, but because they were loved deeply enough to transcend the physical laws that governed lesser treasures. For the first time in decades, Obadiah fell asleep without the familiar weight of guilt pressing against his chest. Instead, he carried the lightness of possibility, the hope that forgiveness might be simpler than he'd imagined, and that grace might work in ways more generous than his careful faith had ever allowed him to believe. Thomas arrived at the Anchor Inn on Tuesday morning, carrying a cardboard box filled with photocopied documents, his eyes bright with the excitement of discovery. Martha served coffee on the inn's front porch while Thomas spread his findings across the weathered table like puzzle pieces waiting to form a picture. "I've been digging through maritime records from the mid-1800s, he announced, pulling out a water-stained manifest. "Look at this. The merchant vessel Sarah's Hope, which foundered in a storm off Pemaquid Point in October 1847. Obadiah leaned forward, studying the faded ink. Among the listed cargo, barrels of flour, bolts of cloth, agricultural tools. One entry made his breath catch: miscellaneous household goods belonging to the Lapp family. Pennsylvania, bound for new settlement in Aroostook County. Lapp, he whispered. "That's my family name." "Gets more interesting," Thomas continued, producing a passenger manifest. Jacob Lapp, age 8, listed with his parents, Ezra and Rebecca, and 2 older siblings. The similarities sent a chill down Obadiah's spine. Jacob, aged 8, the same age his brother had been when he drowned. The same name, the same circumstances of loss, separated by more than a century. "The ship went down in a sudden squall," Thomas explained. "Only 3 survivors out of 47 passengers and crew. The Lapp family was not among them." He paused, watching Obadiah's face carefully. "But here's where it gets truly unusual." From the box, Thomas withdrew a fragment of aged paper, its edges eaten by time and salt water. The handwriting was faint, but still legible. Jacob's wooden horse was found sealed inside an oyster shell 3 days after the wreck. The shell had somehow closed around the toy, preserving it perfectly, while the rest of the cargo was destroyed or scattered. Obadiah's hands trembled as he reached for the document. "This can't be coincidence. I've been researching maritime mysteries for 40 years, Thomas said quietly. "I've learned that the ocean keeps its own schedule, follows its own logic. Sometimes it gives back what was taken, but not always in the ways we expect." Martha refilled their coffee cups, her movements careful and thoughtful. She'd been listening to their conversation with the attention of someone who'd seen enough of life to know that extraordinary things sometimes happen to ordinary people. "So you're saying this horse—" Obadiah touched his jacket pocket where the carving rested. "Might have been traveling for over 170 years, waiting to find me?" "I'm saying the ocean has its own way of completing stories," Thomas replied. "And sometimes those stories span generations." The implications overwhelmed him. If this were true, then his discovery wasn't random chance or divine punishment for old guilt. It was connection, a thread linking past and present, binding the grief of 2 families across impossible spans of time. That afternoon, Obadiah walked to the exact spot where he'd found the oyster. The tide was low, exposing tide pools filled with sea anemones and hermit crabs. He knelt beside the granite outcropping, running his fingers over rock worn smooth by countless tides. The wooden horse felt warm in his pocket, almost alive with the weight of its journey. If Thomas's theory was correct, this small carving had survived storms that sank ships, currents that scattered cargo across ocean floors, and decades of salt water that should have destroyed any organic material. What am I supposed to do with this knowledge? He spoke aloud, addressing the question to the endless water. What am I supposed to learn? The ocean offered no immediate answer, just the eternal conversation between wave and stone that had been going on since the world began. But standing there, Obadiah felt something shift in his understanding. The horse wasn't a burden or a mystery to be solved. It was a gift, a tangible reminder that love could transcend the boundaries of time and death. Wednesday evening brought an unexpected phone call. Bishop Samuel Stoltzfus's voice carried clearly across the connection, weighted with concern and authority. Obadiah, the community is worried about you. You've been gone 6 weeks now, with no word about when you're planning to return. 6 weeks. The time had passed without his notice, measured in conversations with Martha and Thomas, in morning walks along the shore, in quiet moments when the wooden horse seemed to pulse with warmth in his pocket. I'm well, Samuel. Just taking time to process Sarah's passing. Grief is natural and necessary, the bishop replied. But isolation from the community isn't the answer. Your family needs you. The farm needs attention. Your spiritual welfare requires the support of your brothers and sisters in faith. Obadiah looked out his inn window toward the harbor, where fishing boats bobbed at their moorings like prayers on water. The Amish way emphasized community above individual need, duty above personal exploration. For 76 years, he'd followed that path faithfully. I understand your concerns, he said carefully, but I'm not ready to return yet. God seems to have work for me to do here. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough to make him wonder if the connection had been lost. When Samuel spoke again, his voice carried disappointment mixed with warning. Be careful, Obadiah. The English world has many temptations, many ways of leading even faithful men astray from the narrow path. Don't let grief make you vulnerable to false teachings. After the call ended, Obadiah sat in the gathering dusk, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Was he abandoning his faith by staying in Maine? Was his growing sense of peace a sign of God's blessing or a dangerous self-deception? The wooden horse offered no guidance, just its familiar weight and the warmth that seemed to flow from its carved surfaces. But somewhere in his heart, Obadiah knew his journey wasn't finished. Whatever lesson the ocean was trying to teach him, whatever healing was meant to occur, it required more time than 6 weeks could provide. Thursday morning brought Martha to his door with fresh blueberry muffins and gentle concern. You seemed troubled after your phone call last night, she said, settling into the chair across from his small table. Difficult news from home. Pressure to return. Questions about my spiritual condition. He accepted a muffin gratefully, touched by her continued kindness. My bishop thinks I'm in danger of losing my way. And what do you think? It was such a simple question, yet it cut to the heart of everything he'd been wrestling with. In his Amish community, individual opinion mattered less than collective wisdom. Personal feelings were subordinated to established tradition. But here, beside the ocean that had preserved impossible treasures, Martha was asking him to trust his own spiritual discernment. I think, he said slowly, that I'm closer to God here than I've been in years. Not because this place is holier than home, but because I'm finally quiet enough to hear what he might be trying to tell me. Martha nodded, her understanding evident in the way she listened without rushing to judgment or advice. Sometimes we have to step outside our familiar surroundings to see them clearly. Distance can bring perspective. That evening, Obadiah organized a small dinner at the inn's restaurant, inviting Thomas, Reverend Patricia, and several other locals who'd become part of his expanding circle. As they shared lobster rolls and local stories, he found himself talking about Amish traditions, the barn raisings that brought entire communities together, the quilting circles where women shared wisdom along with needlework, the simple worship services held in homes rather than formal churches. It sounds like a beautiful way of life, observed Helen Crawford, a retired teacher who'd lived in Pemaquid her entire life. So grounded in community and mutual support. It is, Obadiah agreed, but it can also be limiting. We're taught that the outside world is dangerous, full of temptations and false teachings. Most Amish never travel beyond neighboring counties, never experience different ways of understanding faith and fellowship. Thomas raised his water glass in a gentle toast. To new experiences, then, and to the courage it takes to embrace them. As the evening wound down and his friends prepared to leave, Obadiah felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood, the warmth of belonging to a community that accepted him exactly as he was, without requiring him to conform to predetermined expectations. These people had welcomed him despite his plain clothes and unfamiliar ways, had listened to his stories without judgment, had offered friendship without conditions. Back in his room, he took out the notebook Martha had given him and continued writing about his experiences. The words came more easily now, flowing like water finding its natural course. He wrote about the way morning light looked different when reflected off ocean water, about the sound of foghorns in the distance, about conversations that opened new windows in his understanding, and he wrote about the wooden horse, trying to capture the sense of miracle and mystery it represented. Not the dramatic kind of miracle he'd expected from childhood Bible stories, but the quieter miracle of grace, working through impossible circumstances to heal old wounds and open new possibilities. The carved toy sat on his bedside table, catching lamplight in its polished surfaces. Sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep, Obadiah could almost feel it pulsing with warmth, as if the love that had created it, both his love for Jacob and the historical Jacob's family's love for their lost child, was somehow still alive, still working to bring healing across the centuries. Outside his window, the harbor settled into evening quiet, fishing boats secure at their moorings, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere beneath those waters lay the wreck of the Sarah's Hope, its cargo scattered across the ocean floor. But one small treasure had been preserved, had traveled impossible distances to find him at the exact moment when he needed to believe that love could survive any storm. For the first time since Sarah's death, Obadiah felt truly hopeful about the future, not because his circumstances had changed dramatically, but because his understanding of what was possible had expanded. If wooden horses could survive 170 years underwater, if grace could work through oyster shells and ocean currents, then perhaps forgiveness was simpler than he'd imagined. And perhaps God's love was larger and more persistent than his careful theology had ever allowed him to believe. The call came on a rainy Thursday morning while Obadiah was having breakfast with Martha. Bishop Samuel's voice carried even more urgency than before, weighted with the authority of community consensus and spiritual concern. Obadiah, the deacons have met in council. We're deeply troubled by your extended absence and the reports we've received about your activities among the English. Martha quietly withdrew to give him privacy, but not before placing a supportive hand on his shoulder. Through the inn's windows, rain streaked the glass like tears, and the harbor disappeared into grey mist. "What reports?" Obadiah asked, though he suspected he knew. "That you've been attending services at a Protestant church, consorting with unbelievers, engaging in activities that compromise your witness as an Amish man." Samuel's tone grew stern. "More concerning are the stories about some mystical object you claim to have discovered, filling your head with superstitions and false signs." The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to sound plausible, while completely missing the deeper reality of his experience. Yes, he'd attended Reverend Patricia's church, but he'd found there the same God he'd worshipped in Amish services. Yes, he'd formed friendships with English people, but they'd shown him Christian love and support during his darkest hours. "Samuel, I understand your concerns, but I need you to trust that my faith remains strong. If anything, it's grown deeper during my time here. Faith that separates itself from the community of believers isn't faith at all. It's individualistic pride masquerading as spirituality." The bishop's words carried the weight of centuries of Amish teaching. "You have 1 week to arrange your affairs and return home, or the congregation will have no choice but to begin disciplinary proceedings." The line went dead, leaving Obadiah alone with the sound of rain against glass and the weight of an impossible choice. Disciplinary proceedings could mean shunning, complete separation from the community that had shaped every aspect of his life, including his own children and grandchildren who remained faithful to the Ordnung. He reached for his coat pocket, seeking the comfort of the wooden horse, but found only empty fabric. Panic seized him as he searched the pocket more thoroughly, then checked his other pockets, the table around him, the floor beneath his chair. "Martha!" he called, his voice carrying an urgency that brought her running from the kitchen. "The horse, it's gone." "The wooden horse, it's not in my pocket." They searched his room thoroughly, checking under the bed, in the bathroom, through his suitcase. Martha helped him retrace his steps from the previous evening, the restaurant, the porch where he'd sat reading, the path to the shore. "Nothing. Maybe it fell out during your walk yesterday," Martha suggested, but her voice carried doubt. The horse had never simply fallen from his pocket before. It had seemed almost attached to him, present whenever he needed its comfort. At Thomas's suggestion, they organized a search party. Reverend Patricia joined them, along with Helen Crawford and several other friends Obadiah had made during his stay. They combed the shoreline where he'd found the original oyster, searched the historical society where he'd spent hours researching, even checked the church pew where he'd sat during Sunday services. By late afternoon, with rain still falling and no sign of the carving, Obadiah felt a despair deeper than any he'd experienced since Sarah's death. The horse had become more than a mysterious artifact. It had been tangible proof that love could transcend impossible barriers, that grace could work through circumstances beyond human understanding. "I don't understand," he said to Thomas as they stood on the rain-swept shore. "Why would it disappear now, just when I need it most?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying the grey water that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. "Maybe," he said finally, "because you don't need it anymore. Not the physical object, anyway." "What do you mean?" "When Michael died, I carried his dog tags everywhere. They were my connection to him, my proof that his life had mattered. But eventually I realized that my son lived on in my memory, in the lives he'd touched, in the love that continued beyond his physical presence. The dog tags were important for a while, but they weren't the real treasure." That evening, alone in his room, while rain continued to drum against the windows, Obadiah found himself thinking about all the changes that had occurred during his time in Maine. The guilt that had shadowed him for 60 years had lifted. The isolation that had characterized his grief over Sarah's death had been replaced by genuine human connection. The rigid certainties of his faith had expanded to accommodate mystery and wonder. Perhaps Thomas was right. Perhaps the wooden horse had served its purpose, not as a permanent talisman, but as a bridge between his old understanding and his new one. The love it represented hadn't disappeared with the physical object. That love lived on in his transformed relationship with Jacob's memory, in his growing peace with the past, in his openness to possibilities he'd never allowed himself to consider. Still, the loss felt profound. When he reached into his pocket from habit, the emptiness seemed to echo with all the other losses he'd endured, Jacob, Sarah, and now this small miracle that had helped him believe in grace again. Unable to sleep, he walked to the window and looked out at the storm-tossed harbor. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the churning water for brief moments before darkness returned. Somewhere out there, beneath fathoms of salt water, lay the remains of the Sarah's hope, and whatever other treasures the ocean held in its keeping. As he watched, something pale caught his eye on his bedside table, something that hadn't been there moments before. His heart racing, he turned on the lamp and found not the wooden horse, but Sarah's silver thimble, the one she'd used for 40 years of quilting and mending. With trembling hands, he picked up the thimble, feeling its familiar weight and the smooth depression worn by thousands of hours of patient needlework. But how could it be here? He'd left it at home, in Sarah's sewing basket, along with all her other tools and materials. Inside the thimble, barely visible in the lamplight, was a tiny slip of paper. Unfolding it carefully, Obadiah found Sarah's handwriting, words he'd never seen before. Love doesn't end with death, dear heart. It just finds new ways to reach us. The message hit him like a physical blow, not because it was painful, but because it was so perfectly, impossibly Sarah. Her voice in the words, her wisdom in the timing, her love reaching across the boundary between life and death to offer exactly what he needed to hear. As he sat holding the thimble, feeling its warmth spread through his fingers, Obadiah understood that his journey was entering a new phase. The wooden horse had been Jacob's gift, a bridge to forgiveness and peace with the past. But Sarah's thimble represented something different, permission to embrace the future, to build new relationships and explore new possibilities without betraying the love they'd shared. Outside, the storm was beginning to pass, and the first stars appeared between the clouds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The bishop's ultimatum, the choice between his old life and his new understanding. But tonight, he held tangible proof that love truly was stronger than death, more persistent than time, more creative than human imagination in finding ways to offer comfort and hope. The thimble pulsed gently in his palm, warm with 52 years of shared devotion and bright with the promise that some treasures could never be lost, only transformed. Friday morning brought Thomas to the inn with another box of documents. His excitement barely contained, despite the gravity of Obadiah's situation with the bishop. Sarah's thimble sat on the breakfast table between them, catching early sunlight like a small beacon of possibility. I spent the night going through shipping records from the Pennsylvania Historical Society, Thomas announced, spreading papers across the table with the care of someone handling precious artifacts. Look at this passenger manifest from the Sarah's Hope. I missed it before because it was filed separately. Obadiah studied the faded document. Among the listed passengers, one name made his breath catch. Sarah Lapp, age 19, seamstress, traveling with thimble and sewing implements. Sarah, he whispered. My Sarah was named after her grandmother, but I never knew. There's more, Thomas continued, producing a water-stained letter preserved in a plastic sleeve. This was found in a bottle that washed ashore in 1891, 44 years after the wreck. It's from Sarah Lapp, written during the storm that would claim the ship. With trembling fingers, Obadiah read the carefully preserved words. If God wills that I should not survive this night, I pray that someone, someday, will find this message and know that our love does not end with death. My thimble, which holds the work of my hands and the prayers of my heart, I leave as a token that love finds ways to continue its work, even when we cannot. The parallels were overwhelming. Two Sarahs, separated by more than a century, both understanding that love transcended physical death, both leaving tokens of that enduring connection. His Sarah's thimble, impossibly present in his Maine inn-room, seemed to pulse with the accumulated love of generations. The ocean keeps its own records, Thomas said softly, and sometimes those records tell stories that span lifetimes. That afternoon, Obadiah made a decision that surprised even himself. He placed a long-distance call to his eldest son, Samuel Jr., breaking a silence that had lasted since Sarah's funeral 3 months earlier. Father? Samuel's voice carried shock and concern. Where are you? Bishop Samuel said you were in Maine, but we didn't know. I'm well, son. Better than I've been since your mother passed. The words came easier than Obadiah had expected. I called because I need to tell you some things I should have shared years ago. For the next hour, he found himself speaking more openly with his son than he ever had before. He told him about Jacob's drowning, about the guilt he'd carried through 5 decades of marriage, about Sarah's final wish that he see the ocean. He described the wooden horse and the impossible circumstances of its discovery, the thimble that had appeared when he needed proof of love's persistence. Samuel listened with the patience of a man who'd wondered his entire life about the shadows that sometimes crossed his father's face, the careful way Obadiah had always held himself slightly apart from complete joy. I remember Uncle Jacob, Samuel said finally. Not the man he would have become, but the stories Mother used to tell about him. She said he would have loved his nephews and nieces, would have been the kind of uncle who carved toys and told adventure stories. Your mother understood more than I realized, Obadiah replied. She carried my grief along with her own burdens, never complaining, always hoping I would find peace with the past. And have you? Found peace? Obadiah looked out at the harbor, where fishing boats were returning with the day's catch, their voices calling across the water in the timeless ritual of safe harbor. I'm beginning to. But it means staying here longer, Samuel. It means disappointing the bishop and perhaps facing consequences I'm not ready for. Then stay, his son said simply. Mother would want you to find healing, wherever that might lead. The farm is fine. The community will understand eventually. Your spiritual welfare matters more than their expectations. After the call, Obadiah sat in the gathering dusk feeling lighter than he had in decades. His son's blessing carried weight beyond its simple words. It was permission from his own family to follow the path that seemed to be opening before him. That evening, Reverend Patricia stopped by the inn to check on him, bringing news that both encouraged and challenged him. I've been in contact with a colleague who works with Amish communities, she said, accepting Martha's offer of tea. There are precedents for what you're experiencing. Faithful people who found their spiritual calling, leading them beyond traditional boundaries. It's not common, but it's not unheard of. What happened to them? It varied. Some eventually returned to their communities with new perspectives that enriched everyone. Others found different ways to serve God while maintaining their core values. A few discovered that their calling was to build bridges between Amish and English communities. The possibility intrigued him. For weeks, he'd been thinking in terms of choosing between two worlds, his Amish heritage and his new understanding. But what if there was a third option? What if his experience by the ocean was preparing him to help others navigate similar spiritual journeys? There's something else, Patricia continued, reaching into her bag. I found this in the church library yesterday, tucked inside a hymnal that hasn't been opened in years. She handed him a small prayer card, its edges worn soft with age. On one side was a simple illustration of a child's hands folded in prayer. On the other, in a child's careful handwriting, were the words, Jacob Lapp, age 8, God bless my family and keep us safe on our journey. Obadiah's vision blurred as he held the card. Here was another impossible gift, another bridge across time connecting his story to the historical tragedy that had claimed the Sarah's hope. The young Jacob, who had written this prayer, had faced his own uncertain journey. His own hopes and fears about what lay ahead. Where did this come from? He asked. I don't know, Patricia admitted. It wasn't there last week when I was looking for hymns. But there it was, yesterday, placed exactly where you've been sitting during services. Martha joined their conversation, her practical wisdom grounding the mysterious elements in everyday common sense. Seems to me these gifts are appearing when you need them most, she observed. The horse when you needed forgiveness, the thimble when you needed to feel Sarah's love, and now this prayer card when you're wrestling with questions about your spiritual path. What do you think it means? Obadiah asked. I think, Martha said with a smile, it means you're not traveling this journey alone. Never have been, never will be. That night, Obadiah placed the prayer card on his bedside table next to Sarah's thimble, creating a small shrine to the mystery that was reshaping his understanding of faith and possibility. Outside his window, the harbor reflected stars like scattered diamonds, and the eternal conversation between water and shore continued in its ancient rhythm. For the first time since the bishop's ultimatum, he felt genuinely peaceful about the choice ahead of him. Whatever decision he made about returning to Pennsylvania or staying in Maine, he would make it from a place of spiritual confidence rather than fear or guilt. The gifts he'd received, the horse, the thimble, the prayer card, weren't magical talismans, but tangible reminders that grace worked through circumstances beyond human control, that love found ways to transcend every boundary that seemed to contain it. The ocean had taught him that some treasures were worth the risk of storms, and some journeys led to destinations more wonderful than any traveler had dared to imagine. The storm hit Pemaquid Point with the fury of nature unleashed, driving rain horizontal across the harbour and sending waves crashing against the rocky shore with thunderous force. Obadiah woke before dawn to the sound of wind howling around the inn's corners and the crack of something, a tree branch, perhaps, or loose shutters, striking the building. Despite the weather's violence, something drew him from the warmth of his room to the wild shore. He dressed quickly, grabbed his heaviest coat, and made his way through the inn's corridors to the front door. Martha appeared from the kitchen, her face etched with concern. "You can't go out in this," she protested. "The weather service is calling it the worst storm in 20 years. But Obadiah felt a pull stronger than common sense, an urgency that reminded him of the mysterious forces that had been guiding his journey since the first wooden horse appeared. "I have to," he said simply. "Something's waiting for me out there." The walk to the shore was treacherous, wind threatening to knock him from the rain-slicked path, salt spray stinging his face like needles. But he pressed on, guided by an instinct deeper than logic, until he reached the granite outcropping where his adventure had begun weeks earlier. There, wedged between the same two massive stones where he'd found the first oyster, was another shell, this one even larger, ancient beyond measure, its surface encrusted with what looked like decades of marine growth. The storm waves crashed around it, but the oyster remained firmly lodged, as if it had been waiting through countless tides for this exact moment. Working by lightning flashes and the dim glow of his flashlight, Obadiah pried the massive shell from its rocky cradle. It was heavier than the first one, requiring all his strength to lift. Unlike its predecessor, this oyster showed no resistance when he inserted his knife. It opened as easily as if it had been waiting decades to reveal its contents. Inside, nested in what remained of the oyster's ancient tissue, was the wooden horse. Not another carving, but the original one, the very toy he had carved for Jacob 60 years ago. He recognized every cut, every tiny imperfection where his young hands had slipped with the knife. This was his work, impossibly preserved, impossibly returned to him across 6 decades and 200 miles of distance. But that wasn't all. Wrapped around the horse's legs was a piece of cloth, fabric he recognized immediately as coming from the shirt Jacob had been wearing the day he drowned. The material should have disintegrated long ago, but here it was, faded but intact, still tied in the careful knot Jacob had made to secure his most precious possession. Lightning illuminated the scene in stark detail as Obadiah held both horses, the mysterious copy he'd found weeks ago and now the original he'd carved as a 17-year-old boy. They were identical in every way except one. The original bore a small inscription on its base, letters he'd carved so tiny they were barely visible. For Jacob, with love from Obadiah. 1963, the discovery shattered every theory he'd constructed about his experience. This wasn't about historical parallels or maritime preservation mysteries. This was about his actual horse, his actual brother, impossibly returned from the depths of Willow Creek to the shores of Maine. The physical laws governing such preservation didn't matter. What mattered was that love had found a way to transcend every boundary that should have contained it. Through the storm's chaos, Thomas appeared, having followed Obadiah's path despite the dangerous conditions. The historian took one look at the two horses and understood immediately that they had moved beyond the realm of scholarly explanation into something far more profound. "The original," Thomas said, his voice barely audible above the wind, 60 years underwater, first in Pennsylvania Creek, then somehow making its way to the ocean. Traveling currents I can't imagine to end up here. Obadiah's voice carried wonder rather than confusion. "It's impossible, but here it is." Thomas examined both carvings in the flashlight's beam, his trained eye confirming what they both already knew. "The question isn't how," he said finally. "The question is what you're supposed to do with this gift." As if in answer to his question, Obadiah felt a sudden clarity about the choice he'd been wrestling with. The bishop's ultimatum, the pressure from his community, the fear of consequences, all of it seemed insignificant compared to the magnitude of what he was holding. These horses weren't just carved toys. They were proof that the universe operated according to laws larger than human understanding, that love could accomplish things that defied every rational explanation. Back at the inn, drenched and shivering but spiritually transformed, Obadiah called Bishop Samuel despite the early hour. The older man's voice carried irritation at being awakened, but his tone changed when Obadiah began describing what had occurred. "Samuel, I need you to listen without interrupting," Obadiah said. "What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I'm holding the proof in my hands." For 20 minutes, he recounted the entire story, from finding the first oyster through discovering the original wooden horse in the storm. He described the historical research, the impossible preservation, the gifts that had appeared exactly when he needed them most. When he finished, silence stretched across the connection. "Obadiah," the bishop said finally, "if what you're telling me is true, it is true. I have witnesses, documentation, physical evidence. This isn't delusion or wishful thinking. This is God working through circumstances I can't begin to understand." Another long pause. "Assuming these events occurred as you describe, what do you believe God is calling you to do?" It was the question Obadiah had been preparing for without realizing it. "I believe he's calling me to stay here, to learn what this community of believers has to teach me, and to find ways to share what I've learned with others who might need to hear that love is stronger than death, that forgiveness is possible, that grace works in ways more wonderful than our theology allows us to imagine." "That sounds dangerously close to universalism," Samuel warned. "Our way is narrow for good reasons. I'm not abandoning our faith," Obadiah replied. "I'm discovering how large it really is. The God who can preserve wooden horses in ocean waters for 60 years is not limited by our understanding of how salvation works. Perhaps our way is one path among many that lead to the same destination." The bishop's disapproval was palpable through the phone line. "The deacons will not accept such reasoning. If you choose to remain in Maine, you choose separation from the community that has nurtured your faith since birth." "Then that's a choice I'll have to make," Obadiah said, surprised by his own calm certainty. "But I won't make it out of rebellion or pride. I'll make it out of obedience to what I believe God is asking of me." After ending the call, Obadiah sat in his room, studying the 2 wooden horses by lamplight. The copy and the original, separated by 170 years of history, yet united in their message of enduring love. Tomorrow would bring consequences, possible excommunication, separation from family members who remained faithful to traditional expectations, loss of the community identity that had defined him for 7 decades. But tonight, he felt more spiritually alive than he had in years. The horses pulsed warmly in his hands, tangible proof that some stories were larger than individual understanding, some gifts more generous than human imagination could contain, some love strong enough to transcend every boundary that seemed to limit it. Bishop Samuel arrived in Pemaquid on a grey Tuesday morning, accompanied by 2 deacons and Obadiah's eldest son. The black sedan looked foreign against the backdrop of fishing boats and weathered shingles, its Pennsylvania license plates marking it as distinctly out of place in the Maine harbor town. Martha met them at the inn's entrance with the reserved politeness she reserved for difficult situations. "Gentlemen, Mr. Lapp is expecting you. He's asked me to provide a private dining room where you can talk without interruption." Obadiah waited in the inn's back parlor, the 2 wooden horses arranged carefully on the table before him alongside Sarah's thimble and young Jacob's prayer card. He had spent the morning in prayer and reflection, preparing for what might be the most important conversation of his life. Samuel Jr. entered first, his face carrying the complex mixture of love and disappointment that children sometimes hold for parents who have strayed from expected paths. Behind him came Bishop Samuel, a man of 70 whose authority came not from harsh judgment but from genuine concern for his flock's spiritual welfare. The two deacons, Joseph Yoder and Aaron Byler, were men Obadiah had known for decades, farmers whose wisdom came from lives spent in careful observation of natural cycles and divine providence. "Father," Samuel Jr. said, embracing him with genuine warmth, despite the circumstances. "You look well. Different, but well." "I am well, son. Probably better than I've been in years." Obadiah gestured to the chairs Martha had arranged around the table. "Please sit. We have much to discuss." Bishop Samuel's eyes immediately focused on the artifacts displayed on the table. "So these are the objects that have convinced you to abandon your community and faith." "Not abandon," Obadiah replied gently. "Expand. These objects have taught me that God's grace works in ways larger than our understanding typically allows." For the next hour, he recounted his story in careful detail, beginning with Sarah's deathbed request and continuing through the discovery of both wooden horses. He showed them Thomas's research, the historical documents linking his experience to the 1847 shipwreck, the impossible preservation of items that should have been destroyed decades ago. The deacons listened with the patient attention of men accustomed to weighing evidence before making judgments. Samuel Jr. had heard the basics during their phone conversation, but seeing the physical artifacts and hearing the complete narrative clearly affected him. Only Bishop Samuel remained skeptical, his expression growing more troubled as the story unfolded. "Even accepting that these events occurred as you describe," the bishop said finally, "I fail to see how they justify abandoning the life of faith you've maintained for 70 years. "I haven't abandoned faith. I've discovered its true size," Obadiah replied. "The God who can preserve wooden toys for 60 years underwater, who can connect stories across centuries, who can work through oyster shells and ocean currents to bring healing, that God is not limited by our human categories. And yet, you've been attending Protestant services, associating with those outside our faith community, engaging in practices that compromise your witness as an Amish believer." It was the argument Obadiah had expected, rooted in the separation principles that had protected Amish communities for centuries. But his weeks in Maine had taught him that protection could sometimes become isolation, that safety could prevent the very growth it was meant to foster. "I've attended services at a church where I found the same God we worship at home," he said. "I've formed friendships with people whose love and support sustained me through the darkest period of my life. I've discovered that faithful Christians exist outside our community boundaries." Aaron Byler, the younger of the two deacons, spoke for the first time. "But what about the distinctiveness of our faith? If salvation is available through any path, what makes our way special?" It was a thoughtful question, one that went to the heart of Amish identity. Obadiah had wrestled with it himself during long nights of prayer and reflection. "Our way is special because it's ours," he said. "Because it's the path God used to shape us, to teach us about community and simplicity and faithfulness. But specialness doesn't require uniqueness. The ocean has many currents, but they all flow toward the same destination." Martha appeared in the doorway, her timing perfect as always. "Gentlemen, there are some people who would like to speak with you if you're willing. Members of our community who have come to know Mr. Lapp during his time here." The bishop frowned. "We didn't come here to be influenced by outside voices." "With respect," Obadiah said, "these aren't outside voices. They're witnesses to what God has been doing in my life these past months. Surely their testimony deserves consideration." Thomas entered first, carrying a folder thick with documents. He was followed by Reverend Patricia, Helen Crawford, and several other townspeople who had become part of Obadiah's extended family. Their presence transformed the room's atmosphere, bringing warmth and light to what had been a formal interrogation. "Bishop Samuel," Thomas began, "I understand your concerns about Obadiah's extended stay here, but I want you to know that in 40 years of living in this community, I've never seen anyone have such a positive impact on so many people." Reverend Patricia nodded agreement. "Obadiah has blessed our congregation immeasurably. His stories about Amish life have enriched our understanding of Christian community. His quiet faith and gentle wisdom have touched everyone he's met. Helen Crawford stepped forward, her teacher's instincts helping her find exactly the right words. He's shown us what it means to live simply, to find joy in small things, to trust God even when life doesn't make sense. Those are gifts his community gave him, and he's shared them freely with us. One by one, Obadiah's Maine friends offered testimony about the ways his presence had affected their lives. They spoke of his patient listening during their troubles, his practical help with community projects, his gentle guidance for those struggling with faith questions. Picture emerged of a man whose Amish values had flowered beautifully in new soil, producing fruit that nourished everyone around him. Samuel Jr. listened with growing amazement. "I had no idea," he said quietly. "Father, I've never heard people speak about anyone the way these folks speak about you." Even Bishop Samuel seemed affected by the testimonies, his stern expression softening as he heard example after example of Christian love in action. But he remained troubled by the theological implications. "All of this may be true," he said when the testimonies ended, "but it doesn't address the fundamental issue. Obadiah has separated himself from the community that nurtured his faith. He's embracing practices and relationships that compromise his distinctiveness as an Amish believer." Thomas reached into his folder, producing a document Obadiah hadn't seen before. "Bishop, there's something else you should know. I've been corresponding with historians in Pennsylvania, researching the early Amish settlements in your area." He spread out a genealogical chart showing family connections across multiple generations. Obadiah's great-great-grandfather, Isaac Lapp, left the Amish community in 1834 to join a Mennonite congregation that felt called to minister to English settlers. Isaac believed God was calling him to build bridges between communities rather than maintain separation. The revelation stunned Obadiah. He had never heard this story, never known that his own bloodline included someone who had faced a similar choice between tradition and calling. Isaac eventually returned to Amish life, Thomas continued, but not before spending 15 years serving in that Mennonite church. The community welcomed him back because they recognized that his time away had deepened rather than weakened his faith. Bishop Samuel examined the documents carefully, his trained eye verifying their authenticity. "You're suggesting there's precedent for what Obadiah is doing?" "I'm suggesting that sometimes God calls faithful people to expand their understanding by temporarily stepping outside familiar boundaries," Thomas replied. Isaac Lapp's experience enriched the entire community when he returned. Perhaps Obadiah's journey will have similar results. The room fell quiet as everyone absorbed this new information. Outside, the eternal conversation between ocean and shore continued, speaking of persistence and change, of constancy within movement, of the way love finds new channels while maintaining its essential character. Obadiah felt something shifting in the spiritual atmosphere of the room. The wooden horses on the table seemed to pulse with warmth. Sarah's thimble caught the light like a small beacon, and young Jacob's prayer card reminded everyone present that faith sometimes required journeys into unknown territory. For the first time since the confrontation began, he felt genuinely hopeful that understanding might be possible, that love could build bridges even across theological differences, that his community might find ways to honor both tradition and the mysterious workings of divine grace. That evening, alone in his room while his visitors rested at a nearby bed and breakfast, Obadiah discovered another impossible gift. As he opened his suitcase to retrieve a clean shirt, his hands found fabric that shouldn't have been there. Delicate white cotton with tiny pearl buttons, fabric he recognized immediately, despite its impossible presence. Sarah's wedding dress lay folded at the bottom of his suitcase. The same gown she had worn 62 years ago when they pledged their lives to each other before God and community. The dress showed no signs of age or wear, appearing exactly as it had on their wedding day, crisp, clean, and somehow infused with the joy and hope of that long-ago morning. Beneath the dress, wrapped in tissue paper that crackled with age, was a letter in Sarah's careful handwriting. With trembling fingers, Obadiah unfolded pages that contained words he had never seen, dated just 3 days before her death. "My dearest Obadiah," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then my prayers have been answered, and you have found the courage to see the ocean I always dreamed we would visit together. I know you are wrestling with questions about faith and community, about whether staying true to God means staying within the boundaries we have always known." Obadiah's vision blurred as he continued reading. Sarah's words spoke directly to his current struggle with an understanding that took his breath away. "I have packed my wedding dress because it represents the promises we made, not just to each other, but to the God who brought us together. Those promises were about love enduring beyond death, about faithfulness that transcends physical presence, about hope that looks beyond current circumstances to see what might be possible." The letter continued for several pages, revealing depths of Sarah's wisdom he had never fully appreciated. She wrote about conversations they'd never had aloud, dreams she'd kept private to avoid troubling him, insights about his character that showed how completely she had understood him. "You have always been afraid that loving deeply made you vulnerable to loss," she wrote. "Jacob's death taught you to hold yourself slightly apart from complete joy, as if caring less might somehow prevent future grief. But love that protects itself from loss isn't really love at all. It's just fear wearing love's clothing." The words hit him with the force of revelation. Sarah had seen through his careful constructions, understood the ways grief had shaped even their marriage, recognized the barriers he'd built around his heart without ever naming them directly. "The wooden horse you carved for Jacob was perfect because you held nothing back," the letter continued. "Every cut was made with complete attention, every smooth curve shaped by pure love. That's how you loved me too, despite your fears, completely, generously, without reservation. Don't let my death teach you to love less. Let it teach you to love more boldly, more openly, with less concern for protecting yourself from pain." The final paragraphs spoke directly to his current situation with a specificity that made him wonder if Sarah had somehow foreseen his journey to Maine, his struggles with community expectations, his discovery of grace working outside familiar boundaries. If God calls you to step outside our community's comfort zone, trust that calling. The faith we shared was large enough to encompass mystery, generous enough to recognize truth wherever it appeared, confident enough to believe that love finds ways to continue its work even when we cannot see the path ahead. The letter concluded with words that felt like a blessing and a release. "Be well, my beloved. Be bold. Be open to the impossible gifts that grace provides to those brave enough to receive them. And remember that our love continues not as a burden to be carried, but as wings to lift you toward whatever adventures still await." Obadiah sat holding the letter and the wedding dress as moonlight streamed through his window, illuminating the harbor where so many impossible gifts had already appeared. Sarah's permission to embrace his new life felt like the final piece of a puzzle he'd been unconsciously assembling for months. The next morning brought the formal confrontation he'd been preparing for since Bishop Samuel's arrival. The inn's dining room had been cleared of other guests, creating a space where life-changing decisions could be made with the dignity they deserved. Bishop Samuel opened the meeting with prayer, asking for divine guidance in matters that affected not just Obadiah's future, but the integrity of the community they all served. His words were careful and respectful, acknowledging the complexity of the situation while maintaining clear expectations. "Obadiah, we have listened to your story, examined your evidence, and considered the testimony of your friends here in Maine," the bishop began. "We cannot dispute that unusual events have occurred, or that your time here has been meaningful. But the question remains, what does faithfulness require of you now?" It was the moment Obadiah had been preparing for without fully realizing it. He stood, feeling Sarah's blessing surrounding him like an invisible cloak. The impossible gifts arranged on the table as witnesses to grace's creative power. Samuel, I have spent 76 years trying to live faithfully within the boundaries our community has established, he said. Those boundaries protected me, nurtured me, gave me structure and purpose. But they also limited me in ways I'm only now beginning to understand. He picked up the original wooden horse, feeling its familiar weight and warmth. This carving represents the best of who I was at 17. Loving, generous, hopeful, unafraid to invest completely in others' happiness. Jacob's death taught me to be more careful, more guarded, more concerned with preventing loss than with celebrating love. Samuel Jr. leaned forward, his face reflecting both concern and growing understanding. The deacons listened with the careful attention they gave to all matters affecting community welfare. Sarah's letter. Obadiah held up the pages that had appeared so mysteriously. Reminds me that faithfulness isn't about avoiding risk or maintaining safety. It's about trusting God enough to follow where love leads, even when that path takes us beyond familiar territory. Bishop Samuel's expression remained troubled. But what about community? What about the mutual accountability that has preserved our faith through centuries of persecution and change? If everyone follows their individual sense of calling, what holds us together? Love holds us together, Obadiah replied. Not rules or boundaries or fear of consequences, but the same love that connects me to Jacob across 60 years, to Sarah beyond death, to historical figures I never met, whose stories somehow became part of my own healing. The room fell silent as the implications of his words settled over everyone present. Outside, fishing boats moved across the harbor in their ancient patterns, following courses marked by experience and wisdom rather than rigid regulations. Thomas Morrison appeared in the doorway, carrying one final document that would change everything. "Forgive the interruption," he said, "but I've just received word from the Pennsylvania Historical Society. They've located Isaac Lapp's journal from his time with the Mennonite congregation." He handed Bishop Samuel a photocopied page, its margins filled with careful handwriting. Isaac writes about a spiritual experience that convinced him he was called to serve outside Amish community boundaries, a vision involving items that had belonged to his deceased brother, appearing impossibly in his possession as signs of divine guidance. The parallel was unmistakable. Obadiah's great-great-grandfather had experienced something remarkably similar to his own journey, had wrestled with the same questions about faithfulness and community, had ultimately found ways to honor both his individual calling and his communal responsibilities. Bishop Samuel read the journal entry twice, his face reflecting the internal struggle between tradition and mystery, between safety and faith. When he looked up, his expression had shifted from skeptical concern to cautious openness. "If this pattern has appeared in your family before," he said slowly, "if Isaac's experience ultimately strengthened rather than weakened our community, then perhaps we need to consider that God may indeed be working through circumstances we don't fully understand." The words hung in the salt air like a bridge between worlds, offering possibility where there had been only ultimatum, hope where there had been only conflict. Obadiah felt something loosening in his chest, not just relief, but the profound peace that comes when love finds ways to transcend the boundaries that seem to contain it. The ceremony took place at sunset on Pemaquid Point, where the lighthouse stood sentinel over waters that had witnessed countless partings and reunions. Obadiah had chosen this spot not for its dramatic beauty, but because it represented the intersection of all the currents that had brought him to this moment. The historical tragedy of the Sarah's hope, the personal grief that had driven him from Pennsylvania, the impossible gifts that had taught him about grace. Bishop Samuel stood beside him at the water's edge, his presence a bridge between Obadiah's old life and whatever lay ahead. The decision to witness this ceremony had not come easily, but Isaac Lapp's journal had provided precedent that even the most traditional leader could not ignore. If God had worked through similar circumstances in their family's past, then perhaps divine mystery deserved respect rather than resistance. Samuel Jr. was there too, along with the two deacons who had traveled from Pennsylvania with questions about their community members' spiritual health. They had found instead a man whose faith had expanded rather than diminished, whose commitment to Christian love had grown deeper through his time away from familiar boundaries. Martha and Thomas flanked the small gathering, along with Reverend Patricia and a handful of townspeople, who had become family to Obadiah during his months in Maine. The presence of both Amish and English believers created something unprecedented, a congregation, united not by doctrine or tradition, but by recognition of grace, working through impossible circumstances. Obadiah held both wooden horses in his hands, feeling their familiar weight for what might be the last time. The original carving, impossibly preserved and returned after 60 years underwater, represented his childhood love for Jacob and the guilt he had carried too long. The duplicate, with its mysterious origin in the 1847 shipwreck, spoke of connections across time that human understanding could not fully grasp. "These horses have served their purpose," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "They taught me that love survives death, that forgiveness is possible, that grace works in ways more generous than our fears allow us to believe. But symbols are meant to point beyond themselves, not become objects of worship." He walked forward until waves lapped at his plain black shoes. The ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, its surface painted gold and crimson by the setting sun. Somewhere beneath those waters lay the wreck of the Sarah's Hope and whatever other treasures the sea held in its keeping. "Jacob," he said, speaking directly to the brother whose memory had shaped 6 decades of his life, "I release you to whatever peace awaits. I release myself from the guilt that has bound us both. Your love was never meant to be a burden but a blessing, and I choose finally to receive it as the gift it always was." With careful precision, he cast the first wooden horse, the duplicate, into the waves. It disappeared immediately beneath the surface, carried away by currents that had been moving these waters since long before human memory began. "Sarah," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "I release you to the fullness of whatever love awaits beyond this life. I choose to honor our marriage, not by closing my heart to new experiences, but by remaining open to the adventures you always hoped I would embrace." The original wooden horse, carved by his 17-year-old hands with such hope and care, followed its companion into the water. For a moment, both toys were visible beneath the surface, dancing together in the golden light before the ocean claimed them completely. As the final ripples faded, something extraordinary occurred. The water around where the horses had disappeared began to glow with phosphorescence, tiny marine organisms responding to some disturbance too subtle for human senses to detect. The light spread outward in concentric circles, creating rings of blue-green fire that pulsed gently against the shore. But more remarkable than the phosphorescence was what appeared in Obadiah's hand as he stood in the shallows. A smooth beach stone, perfectly round and warm to the touch, had materialized in his palm without his conscious awareness. The stone felt ancient beyond measure, worn by countless tides, yet somehow newly created for this exact moment. Bishop Samuel stepped forward, his face reflecting wonder and recognition. "A remembrance stone," he said softly, "like the ones Joshua commanded the Israelites to gather when they crossed the Jordan River. A physical reminder of the place where God worked miracles." Obadiah closed his fingers around the stone, feeling it pulse gently against his palm like a living heart. This wasn't another mysterious artifact requiring explanation, but something simpler and more profound, a token of completion, a sign that his journey of healing was finally complete. The assembled witnesses stood in reverent silence as the phosphorescence continued to dance across the water's surface. Even the most skeptical observer could not deny that they were witnessing something beyond ordinary experience, something that spoke to mysteries larger than human understanding typically accommodated. "I have made my choice," Obadiah announced, turning to face Bishop Samuel and the others. I will remain in Maine, not as an exile from my faith, but as an extension of it. I will find ways to build bridges between our community and this one, to share the gifts each has offered me. To everyone's surprise, Bishop Samuel stepped forward and embraced him, a gesture that acknowledged not defeat but recognition of divine calling. Working through unexpected channels, Isaac Lapp spent 15 years serving outside our community before returning home, the bishop said. Perhaps your path will be similar, or perhaps God is calling you to something entirely new. Either way, you go with our blessing and the hope that your journey will ultimately strengthen all who encounter its fruits. Samuel Jr. was next to embrace his father, tears flowing freely down his weathered cheeks. Mother would be so proud, he whispered. You found the courage she always hoped you would discover. The deacons offered their own awkward but genuine embraces, their traditional reserve melted by the undeniable evidence of grace working through circumstances beyond their experience. Even they could not argue with phosphorescent waters and stones that appeared in empty hands. As the ceremony concluded and the various witnesses began making their way back toward town, Obadiah remained at the water's edge with the stone warm in his pocket and peace settling over him like evening mist. The wooden horses were gone, returned to the ocean that had preserved and transported them across impossible distances. But the love they represented would continue, not as weight to be carried, but as wings to lift him toward whatever adventures still awaited. The lighthouse beam swept across the harbor in its eternal rhythm, guiding vessels safely home while simultaneously pointing toward horizons beyond current sight. Like his own journey, it served two purposes simultaneously, honoring the past while illuminating pathways toward an unknown but hopeful future. 6 months later, Obadiah stood behind the counter of the Pemaquid Historical Society, carefully cataloging a collection of maritime artifacts that had recently been donated by a local family. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision as he documented each item's provenance and condition, work that had become both vocation and meditation in his new life. The position had evolved naturally from his collaboration with Thomas Morrison on researching the Sarah's Hope tragedy. What had begun as personal investigation had grown into a comprehensive project, documenting Maine's lesser-known maritime disasters and the families affected by them. Obadiah's unique perspective, informed by both scholarly research and personal experience of loss and recovery, brought depth to the work that purely academic approaches could not achieve. Another letter came from Pennsylvania today, Thomas announced, entering the society's main room with the day's mail. Looks like your bishop's handwriting. Obadiah accepted the envelope with a mixture of anticipation and peace that had replaced his earlier anxiety about communication from home. The months since the ceremony at Pemaquid Point had brought a series of letters from Bishop Samuel, each one reflecting growing acceptance of Obadiah's unconventional ministry. What had begun as reluctant tolerance had evolved into something approaching appreciation for the bridges he was building between communities. This letter brought particularly welcome news. Samuel Jr. planned to visit Maine in the spring, bringing his teenage grandson, a young man struggling with questions about faith and community that his traditional upbringing had not adequately addressed. The bishop hoped that Obadiah's unique perspective might help the boy navigate his spiritual journey with less conflict than earlier generations had experienced. Another seeker coming to find you, Martha observed from the doorway, where she'd been arranging flowers in a vase. The Anchor Inn had become an unofficial headquarters for Obadiah's expanding ministry to people wrestling with questions about faith, community, and calling. Word had somehow spread through networks he didn't understand, bringing visitors from unexpected places who'd heard about the Amish man in Maine, who'd found ways to honor both tradition and mystery. Not to find me, Obadiah corrected gently. To find what I found, that grace works in larger ways than we typically imagine, that love finds methods we never thought to look for. The afternoon brought his weekly visit to Thomas's grandson, David, whose presence in Maine represented another kind of healing. The boy had arrived 3 months earlier, sent by parents who hoped Thomas might help him process grief over his father's recent death in a construction accident. What David found instead was a community of people who understood that loss could become the foundation for deeper compassion rather than permanent bitterness. Today's visit had special significance. Obadiah had spent the previous week crafting a small wooden horse, carved with the same care and attention he'd lavished on Jacob's toy decades earlier. The wood was different, Maine pine rather than Pennsylvania maple, but the love invested in each cut was identical. "This is for you," Obadiah said, placing the carving in David's hands. "Not as a replacement for anything you've lost, but as a reminder that love continues its work even when we can't see the methods it uses." The 13-year-old boy turned the horse over in his palms, studying the smooth curves and careful details. "It looks like the ones you threw in the ocean," he said. "Grandpa Thomas told me about your ceremony. Similar, but not identical. Each horse is unique, just as each person's journey through grief follows its own path." Obadiah settled into the chair across from the boy, remembering conversations he'd had with his own grandson years earlier. Before distance and different life choices had created barriers neither of them knew how to cross. "My dad used to carve things too," David said quietly. "Nothing fancy, just animals and birds he'd seen around our property. I still have some of them, but they make me sad now." "Sadness isn't the enemy of love," Obadiah replied. "It's love persisting in the face of loss. Those carvings your father made, they're sad because they matter, because the love that created them was real and strong. The sadness will change over time, but the love will remain." They sat together in comfortable silence, the boy holding his new wooden horse, while Obadiah remembered all the children he'd tried to comfort over the years. His own sons and daughters when they'd faced disappointments, grandchildren wrestling with questions about belonging and purpose. And now this young stranger whose grief had brought him across a continent to find healing. "Will you teach me to carve?" David asked suddenly. "I mean, I know the basics from watching Dad, but you make things that look alive." "I'd be honored to," Obadiah replied, feeling something shift in his chest. The same sensation he'd experienced when the wooden horses first appeared, but gentler now, more familiar. This was how grace worked in ordinary time. Not through dramatic miracles, but through simple opportunities to pass along love through practical acts of care. That evening, as had become his custom, Obadiah walked to the shore where his transformation had begun. The remembrance stone from his ceremony rested warm in his pocket, its presence a constant reminder that some experiences transcended normal categories of understanding. But he no longer needed proof of mystery. He lived surrounded by it, immersed in the daily miracle of human beings choosing to love each other despite uncertainty and loss. The harbor reflected stars like scattered diamonds, just as it had on his first night in Maine when grief had been his only companion. But now the water's surface mirrored a different sky, one filled with connections rather than isolation. Hope rather than guilt, possibilities rather than limitations. A fishing boat rounded the point, its running lights marking progress through darkness toward the safety of harbor. The sight never failed to move him, speaking as it did of journeys completed and burdens safely delivered. Like his own voyage from Pennsylvania, like the historical journey of the Sarah's Hope. Like every human expedition through uncertain waters toward destinations that could only be reached by faith. Behind him, the lights of Pemaquid glowed warmly against the night, Martha's Inn, where weary travelers found rest. Thomas's historical society, where forgotten stories were preserved and honored. The church, where Reverend Patricia continued to preach about love that transcended human boundaries. All of it had become home in ways he'd never expected when grief first drove him to seek solace beside the ocean. The remembrance stone pulsed gently against his palm, warm with the accumulated love of all who had contributed to his healing. Jacob's childhood affection, Sarah's lifelong devotion, the historical Jacob's innocent prayers, and the generous acceptance of strangers who had become family. Love layered upon love, creating something larger than the sum of its individual parts. Tomorrow would bring new visitors seeking answers to old questions, new opportunities to share the lessons learned through impossible gifts and patient grace. David would begin learning to carve, carrying forward traditions that connected him to both his deceased father and his surrogate grandfather. Bishop Samuel's letters would continue arriving, documenting the slow but steady changes occurring within Obadiah's home community as his unconventional ministry bore unexpected fruit. But tonight was for gratitude, for the mysterious currents that had carried wooden horses across decades and miles, for the love that refused to be contained by death or distance, for the grace that worked through oyster shells and human hearts with equal creativity and persistence. As stars emerged more clearly in the darkening sky, Obadiah Lapp stood at the edge of eternity's ocean, finally at peace with both his past and his future, finally understanding that some treasures could only be found by those brave enough to risk everything they thought they knew about how love was supposed to work.